Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks and welcome to our News Impact Talk on the impact of the Malaysian election. I think some might still be joining, but let's start. I think it's been just a little over a month since the landmark November 19th general election. And we had a hung parliament, but we've also had a government and more recently a confidence motion passed and a budget. And we're glad to have with us here today three veteran observers of Malaysian politics who are also on the ground in the election most recently. Amir Rahim is Strategy Director at KRA Group. Shannon Teoh, Bureau Chief at the Straits Times, and Meredith Weiss, a Senior Fellow at RSIS, as well as an academic who's been on the ground in the last few Malaysian elections. And we're going to have them share their thoughts on the result as well as the outcome, and perhaps get them to cast a little forward into the future and see, sort of give their take on how this government might sort of play out, how stable it is, and as well as some of the changes the elections showed about the nature of Malaysian politics and society. Can I invite, I'll invite each of our speakers to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes first, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Feel free to also type your questions in the chat if you have. Perhaps Amir, would you like to start?
Okay, thank you, my dear friend Zakir and Janet Wee at the Singapore FCC for hosting today's talk. It is great. Hello, everyone. It is great to be in a panel with my dear friends, Dr. Meredith and Shannon, and of course, recognizing some familiar faces virtually as well. Of course, as Zakir rightly pointed out, the recently concluded Malaysian GE and of course, the immediate few days, if you were following it, were a nail-biting affair. But most importantly, it was an expected outcome of the hung parliament, which is talked a lot about in the lead up to this elections, given the highly polarized nature of the political discourse in Malaysia and on the ground sentiments in the lead up to the polling day. I would like to start saying that the aftermath of the GE and the formation of the new government, a unity government, it's called, or more accurately, a coalition government led by Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, it does bring a closure to many of the political actors in Malaysia over the past 3 decades, from the sacking of Anwar Ibrahim in 1998, which has had a profound impact, not just at the macro level in Malaysia on perceptions and reputation of our country and the nation, and the ensuing years of court cases, and the legendary fight between Anwar and Dr. Mahathir Anwar versus Najib later. But also, we have to remember at the micro level, there were also profound impact of the fallout between Anwar Ibrahim and Dr. Mahathir. Families were torn apart, split by political differences. Neighbors could not pray at the same mosque just because you supported a particular party or person. And we have to remember some of the then opposition sympathizers in government were marked and denied promotions, so on and so forth. It was really, in a sense, this election, the result with the formation of the government led by Anwar Ibrahim, it does bring some sort of closure to what has happened, what has transpired in Malaysian politics over the past 3 decades. But anyhow, looking at the general election results, I'd like to point out a few things. Of course, we all know that it is a very polarized electorate. No one won outright. No one got the popular votes. Of course, PH lead in plurality of the popular votes, but it is important to note that majority of the Malays voted for this new coalition, Perikatan Nasional, which has passed as one of the driving force in it, whereas the majority of non-Malays voted for Pakatan Harapan. BN, the grand old party of Malaysian politics, is relegated to a party of second choice for both the Malays and the non-Malays. Then also this election, so the strengthening of the Borneo bloc, with GPS, of course, leading the way in Sarawak, and GRS in Sabah. Of course, in the last GE, it's also interesting to note that Pakatan Harapan was the only truly national party contesting in all states in almost full force. BN didn't contest in Sarawak or in Sabah, and Perikatan Nasional only fielded a direct candidate in Beluran in Sabah, and in Sarawak, Ali Biju. Okay, so PH was the was truly a national party, the only national party in the last elections. So that's an interesting development, of course, in Malaysian politics. And apart from that, of course, this is the continued dominance of social media and digital campaigning, and the platform of the season has been TikTok. As I've pointed out in other forums before, in 2013 it was the Facebook election, and 2018 it was a very WhatsApp-heavy election, and this time around, TikTok seems to be a driving force in the political narrative. And we see the influence that social media continues to have, especially on the young first-time voters, 18 to 21 and 21 to 29, but also the above 60 voters who actually who get a lot of their information from TikTok. Of course, a lot of discussions have also been on this rise of PAS, and many people and many analysts also pointed out that it was a surprising increase in support for PAS. But it is, to me, if you have been following the social media conversations, especially on TikTok, this is not surprising, especially for the young ones, because a lot of the political content has been put there ahead of this campaign season. But the thing is, the Malaysian electorate is continuing to change. As you see, with automatic voter registration, voters will continue to be added to the electoral roll. So, like, for instance, I saw an announcement a couple of weeks back was now that the September supplementary electoral roll added some new 83,000 voters to the electoral roll. The 18-year-olds may not necessarily have the same attitudes or priorities of the batch that voted on 19th November. It's an ongoing roll, right? So let's not forget about Undi 18 and also automatic voter registration, which enfranchised the above 21-year-olds who could not or did not or would not vote before, out of the 5.8 to 6.9 million new voters for the 2020 campaign. We must remember that only about 1.2 million were were around 18 to 20. We don't know how many of the 5 million plus new voters voted yet. Of course, initial numbers show that it's a lot. But again, a lot of studies need to be done on this. What did they come out? How did they come out? Will they sit out? Given the outcome of the election, would they still continue to vote? Especially for the state elections in 2023, could they be seasonal or sometime voters? You could say the same thing about the 18 to 20-year-olds. Yeah, PN push a narrative that they won the Malay Muslim youth vote, and that could very well be true. But will they continue to vote? And if they vote, will they still continue voting PN? The same questions as above do apply. And I think they could very well be, so PH's fight would be whoever takes up the anti-PN mantle will be against the changing demographic. Or they may not. We don't know. The narrative that was being pushed in before GE15 was that the young and new voters had no fixed political allegiances. While a large part of them may have broken decisive for PN, the uncertainty of their narratives, I think, would still hold true. This is why, given that PN got a lot of the youth Malay votes, they have a big responsibility. They overperform when most people wrote them off. But now they have a responsibility to these new voters who gave them their first votes. Will they meet their aspirations and win the allegiance of a whole new generation, or let them down and turn them off democracy, or even worse? The high turnout, again, in Malaysia shows Malaysians are willing to vote. But this, again, should not be taken for granted. No side can take any of the changing electorate for granted, for that matter. If they are disappointed by the outcome, my worry is, will these new voters and young voters continue and still want to vote? Moving forward, just last part, 2023, I think personally that I'm optimistic that immediate short term is going to be stable. The political elites and the people would want to give Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim and his newly formed government a chance and give them the space. But of course, as we know, that 2023 will not be it'll be a difficult year on both the political fronts and the economic front. On the political front, of course, you have 6 state elections due in the next 6 to 9 months. So probably we'll see us in the second quarter of next year, at least 6 state elections. And as you know, state elections in Malaysia, it is disruptive for federal government. People in the federal government usually go down to campaign, and this takes the focus away from governing at the federal level. And you also have UMNO party elections. UMNO have got to decide where they want to go. Do they want do they want to continue this alliance with Pakatan Harapan? Are they happy being a partner of Pakatan, or would they want to sit out and try to rebuild the party? Because one of the major surprises of this election is how badly BN, Barisan Nasional, the grand old party of Malaysian politics, how badly they performed. But against all this backdrop of political developments, you also have a tough year ahead economically. The economic challenges of 2023 with global uncertainties, continued, which may have impact on continued rising inflation, that against also, as I said, the backdrop of very tight fiscal situation. So how can how the government can maneuver this very tight fiscal space to keep the rest of the population, the rest of Malaysians happy? And that is a big challenge ahead in 2023. And looking at medium term, to me, the next 1 to 3 years, it is dependent on, again, of course, what is done by the government in the short term. If the government decides to not prioritize things like reforms or changes to even reforms, if the speed of reforms is too big, probably you'll have backlash. But it's more if the government decides to focus on things like settling old scores and all that, which was what was troubling PH in the first round in 2018, then that could set the mood off and make it more complicated in the medium term. So sorry to take a bit more time, but that's my some of my thoughts on the issues, Zakir.
Okay, thank you so much, Amir, for your insights. Let me move on to Meredith now, who is also on the ground in many of the states during the campaign. Meredith, thanks for joining us from New York. Yeah.
Thanks, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel with such smart and knowledgeable people. So thanks, and I will say yes. I was traveled through Semenanjung, but I was not in Sabah and Sarawak during the campaign. So I defer to those who were. And I will say that overall, I was trying to count. I've been seeing Malaysian elections since the late '90s, so since really GE10. And I will say that this one, in many ways, as others have noted, seemed quieter on the ground, just in terms of trauma and so forth, but definitely livelier on social media, which is not surprising, just given evolution in social media. But it did make for a really different dynamic, where you see speakers speaking to no one, ostensibly, but actually into a camera for later viewing. And I kept wondering, is anyone actually watching these live feeds and these other recordings? And don't they have anything better to do? But apparently many did. So, and I will say also that just overall, especially compared with the last couple of elections, in which we saw significant gains incrementally since 2008, at least, by Pakatan, in many ways, this seemed a much more personality-oriented and less agenda-oriented campaign than has been the past. I was reminded of, for instance, the different, agenda-focused posters that one saw in 2013, or the, first 100 days banners that one would see during the 2018 election, during GE14. And there was a lot less of that. And that was not just on the Pakatan side, but on both sides, really. And part of that was just the difficulty of claiming responsibility or credit for the recent agenda, for the recent government's achievements. So you did see some messaging from Pakatan Harapan about the 22 months that they had been in government, but that was sort of recalling something that had been some time in the past, more than 22 months ago. And in the meantime, there was a bit of obfuscation, I thought on the part of both PN and BN, of no one's wanting quite to mention the fact that they had been together in the most recent government, at the same time as, not wanting to ignore COVID relief and things like that had been delivered. I saw one banner in Tambon, of all places, from it was in Ismail Sabri, so a BN poster touting the anti-hopping law, but there really wasn't very much of that, and that was itself sort of surprising. So some key, sort of my main thoughts on what happened and sort of key developments and implications in no particular order. So first, I'm really struck by the extent to which during the campaign, there were really openly expressed concerns about the dangers of a marriage of convenience for the coalition that everyone felt would have to be formed after the election, given, as Amir noted, the widespread assumption of a hung parliament. So many who express real doubts or strong preferences about not allying, whether it be with Zahid's UMNO or with DAP, now are doing so. And those really sharp initial opinions and pushback before that coalition, the unity government formed, was solidified. Before that, leaves some ground for subsequent pushback, especially if things don't go entirely smoothly or in party level elections. So I do think that there might still be some recalibration. There also could be a limit to what voters will accept. So even ahead of the elections, all of the discussion of possible big tent solutions, sort of ironically, part of the premise of that was either anything but DAP or anything but UMNO, and now we see where we are. There was never, it seemed, any real thought at that point that the voters might defect, might say, okay, if you're really coming up with these partners, we won't vote for this coalition. I do think that now that may become more of a concern, especially with, and I'll come back to this, but as Amir noted, newer voters, whether younger or just first time or moving into their second time, with more fluid loyalties. So a vote for pretty much anyone else turned out to be a vote for Zahid. And despite the assurances about who would be the Prime Minister for UMNO, Ismail Sabri is now firmly relegated to literally the backbench. The DAP is accepting a back seat in its government, in which it is the lead party in terms of number of seats, to avoid aggravating UMNO, that they haven't really tried to press their case or to aggravate Malay supporters, may accentuate what was already some buzz about Pakistan's taking Chinese voters for granted as having no option. That said, the strong predictions of a much lower turnout this time, given disillusionment and lack of excitement, those didn't quite come to pass. So it may be that, for instance, voters really will accept a lot in Malaysia. The second point has to do with the parties that there are. So party differentiation is definitely much less solid now than it's been in the past. And I think that the current situation will only accentuate that. So there are 4 levels on which the personality-based rather than party-based strategies really prevailed, that this was a conscious strategy. The first was that for a lot of the party hoppers, they had this vote for me, don't worry about the logo strategy of don't worry about how many different parties I've been in, I'm the same person. And some of them lost, but others, won with that strategy, people like Masa Mariati or Saifuddin Abdullah. The second is differentiating the coalition based on the prime minister. So that also encourages a more personality-based and party-based strategy. So vote for Muhyiddin, for Abba, or for Anwar, less a BN strategy for obvious reasons. But that also had to do with the fact that PN in particular was such a new coalition. The third is a diminishing focus, as I mentioned, on policy differences that was all the more keen for the downplaying of manifestos, given the past that the sense that these coalitions had all been burned in the past, especially Pakistan, and might not be able to deliver. But that meant that voters had little to go on beyond services provided at the grassroots or social media or these sort of ideas about character. And then the fourth fact was that the fact that PN ran under the Pas Bulan, the moon, in its stronghold of Kelantan and Terengganu, which may complicate solidifying over the longer term a PN identity beyond Pas. And Bersatu is not Pas. All the talk of a green wave now, it's a teal wave. And so it's really hard to know, and this I noticed before a question in the chat about this already, that for some, yes, this is an Islamist alternative, this is about PAS, this is about TikTok and so forth. But for many other voters, this is about wanting a communal party that's about UMNO. So there was differentiation to some extent among coalitions in terms of who was more or less corrupt. And PN can still harp on that. So Bersatu in particular differentiated itself from UMNO in terms of that. But that's not a really proactive profile. And I don't see a way that PN can be really aggressive in making anti-corruption their signature issue in Parliament as the opposition with a 2/3 majority, or what seems to be a 2/3 majority. So I do think also that it'll be quite difficult for BN and PH moving forward to differentiate their records to allow retrospective voting next time. But it's also hard to see this unity government as an enduring coalition. Third, sort of related to that, is that there are less clear coalition identities and cohesion in PH and BN and in PN. For instance, the fact of the MIC and HUF not wanting to contest at all at one point over seat allocations right before the election. This doesn't normally happen in BN. But also the governing coalition now, it's not quite clear. For the East Malaysian parties, they've done that strategic maneuvering, but for others, for PH and BN, it's unusual to have to redefine the coalition after the election. And then internal party cohesion, I think, remains an issue within the coalitions as well. So during the campaign or right at the start, you saw some factional infighting compounded by limited resources. So there was some lashing out among parties, which accentuated, again, that candidate-centered campaigning, or leaving candidates, most notably Khairi Jamaluddin, but not just him, really defend for themselves, even though it's the party or the coalition that suffers if that candidate loses. And in addition, harming to some extent or complicating this party and coalition identity building, some of the young reformers who lost, whether Nurul Isa due to lack of groundwork or KJ because he was shunted to a difficult seat, or some other, Shahril as well, one could see anything from internal party coups to reconsolidating around status quo elders who won, but who had manifestly very little popular support. So that leaves some difficult times ahead as well. Fourth, I don't have much more to say, that there's not much sense. It's really an interesting contrast with 2018 in particular. There's not much sense of this Malaysia Baru or an otherwise clear profile for the new government. So all sorts of parties, including the BN in some seats, ran on a change or renewal message. But the sense that this coalition that's governing now was forged by the king rather than by elected officials or by voters' apparent preferences. Interestingly, I don't see any indication that this is diminishing support for the king. Rather, he seems to force for stability in Malaysia's democratic order. But at the same time, there's discussion now of looking through the manifestos and figuring out what the agenda may be. But it's late in the game to be at that point. We've sort of lost the initial luster of a new government without any sense of what this government is for. And the first steps are pretty typical: cash transfer payments, bonus payments for civil servants, again, saying, okay, smaller cabinet, we've heard this before. That's a cabinet that's very political in the ways that appointments are made. And then lastly, and this touches on something that Amir mentioned, the new voters, they were already known to have less strong party loyalty. And given all these weaknesses in party differentiation, coalition identity, that trend seems certain to strengthen. So this unity government may well bring a degree of stability, which is good, but it won't bring certainty or consistency to the party system. So that's not to say that Malaysia should want or will necessarily seek a return to single party dominance, but there is a middle ground between the sort of Indonesian style personal vehicles and a really much more rigid party dominance. So in terms of what that means moving forward, I do think there's a possibility of some institutional reforms. Those were in all the parties' manifestos. There are low-hanging fruit amongst these, like the citizenship for Malaysian women's children, separation of the AG and the public prosecutor. That seems possibly happening. Some at least weak political financing, since that was so close to getting on the parliamentary slate last time. And also because PN was just so clearly well-resourced and they're not in government. There could be some other types of institutional strengthening as well. I doubt it'll be anything really dramatic, but it would be helpful. I agree with Amir, there'll be a real urgency to an economic program. And while there's a temptation to resort to targeted goodies to solidify support, there won't be the fiscal space to do that to a substantial extent. I do find it notable the fact that the word Bumiputra does not appear in the BN manifesto. It's very much a needs-based program, which is in line with Pakistan's program to a greater extent than Bersatu's was last time when Bersatu was part of Pakistan. But given this green wave rhetoric in the sense that the BN is holding the line against that within the unity government, there could be a shift back toward a Malay agenda just to assert the salience of BN within that coalition. I do think that there'll be probably some greater decentralization or at least granting of some concessions in terms of autonomy for East Malaysia. That could be on identity lines, less strong Malay Muslim messaging, for instance, or it could be economic policy or some mix. And then lastly, as Amir noted, I think the state elections will oblige some potentially very difficult decisions. So there does seem to be some movement now toward competing as a unified coalition, BN and BH sharing out seats and so forth at the state level. But it's not clear to me that that will stick in states where one coalition does have a clear advantage. For instance, in Penang, there's no need necessarily to mirror the coalition at the state level that we have at the federal level, but that does potentially make for some difficult rhetoric ahead as that governing process happens. And I will stop there with apologies for going on so long.
Thanks, Meredith, for such great insights from the ground. We've got a few questions already in the chat. Let me invite Shannon to give his thoughts and perhaps some of his responses.
Hi, Zakir. Yeah, just like you, I'm seeing a lot of questions pile up, but I don't want to take them before my learned panelists do. I just a very few short comments. I think Amir and Meredith has laid out, pretty much a landscape as it stands right now very well. I don't really have much to add, but just on 2 points. I did have the great privilege of speaking with some ambassadors. It was supposed to be with some ambassadors, but it turned out to be speaking to some ambassadors recently, and they made me pick up the mic and say some stuff. And I found that the two key questions they were interested in, so I'm just going to share my thoughts on the same questions, is how stable do we think Anwar's government is? And this was before the confidence vote, and would he have 2/3? And as it stands right now, it looks like he has 2/3. It's not confirmed, but the state of his 2/3 is kind of strange, right? It's exactly 148. So can you count on 148? If you wanted to move a constitutional amendment, for example, one of the things that people have talked about would be term limits for the Prime Minister, 10 years, something like that. There's also the question of whether, Pakatan Harapan would want to fix the malapportionment, not just by shifting electoral boundaries, but creating new seats even, so that you can even it out between states, not just inside the state. Those would need 2/3, right? But can you run the risk of the same thing happening? A deputy minister, no less, was late to parliament, so the speaker couldn't get 148 votes, the speaker got 147. You had a miscommunication where deputy speaker got 146 votes because some MPs didn't realize they could vote for 2 deputy speakers. So things like that can happen, right? COVID's not over. You can have people on forced quarantine. You have a vote and you need a 2/3 majority. 5 people have to be quarantined because they were in a select committee meeting together or something, and you end up with 143. So what this necessitates is that if you are talking about how does Anwar have the numbers, he has a very solid majority. He can govern. There's no question about the fact that he can pass bills, he can pass supply bills, budget 2023 should be safe, so on and so forth. The question is how far-reaching is his ambition, right? And if he's looking at doing reforms, very, very deep reforms like term limits, like changing electoral boundaries, so on and so forth, it still necessitates that he has to reach across the aisle. He has to get someone, if not the entire Perikatan Nasional, then some segments of it, maybe one party, two parties in it, so on and so forth, to get across, to be safe of the numbers. And this kind of reminds of the situation we had with 2018. Pakatan Harapan did not have two-thirds majority back then in 2019, but they reached across the aisle and they got the necessary support. So that's the situation with Anwar's numbers. And the other question that seemed to be a popular one was, are we in a situation where the constitutional monarch is practicing some level of activism? And I think there are varying opinions about this. My answer to them, unfortunately, there was a royal in the audience, so I couldn't go so tough on it. I think the fact is that the monarch has to pick a winner, right? He had to pick a winner in 2020. The monarch also had, on one point, I think the monarch might have overstepped, which was on the declaration of emergency and actually refusing to declare an emergency. Some legal experts might say that the king doesn't have discretion in that particular aspect. But in 2020, as the same king has had to do it again in 2022, pick a winner, really. I mean, if by all accounts, no one is disputing the fact that Muhyiddin had 115 statutory declarations. The question was whether the king would accept that as a way of showing that you have a majority. And in 2020, he went through several different processes. He interviewed MPs one by one, and then he interviewed party leaders, and then he had to pick a winner. Right? And I use the term very strictly here. He had to pick a winner. It wasn't that a winner was presented to him and then he just officiates the winner, right? In this case, again, because we had a hung parliament, Malaysia's first hung parliament, he had to decide. But, you know, we abide by the wisdom of the monarch. And what we've come up with now is that for the first time since 2008, we have a government that's actually made up of the majority of votes. We didn't have that in 2013, right? There was a government made up of about, I remember, about 47% of the popular vote. It didn't happen in 2018. Pakatan Harapan didn't win the popular vote either. But right now you have a government which largely represents the people, right? The majority of the people. And so I think this speaks to the question of, and one of the questions that's been put together here by that whether the Anwar government is a unity government, will it be able to bring together the polarized electorate? It does have a chance to do so, right? It represents the majority of people. Can it perform for this majority, and can it keep this majority? And we're not talking about seats, we're talking about people here. And so that's going to be pretty important moving forward. And I think my fellow panelists have talked about the pace of reforms, the fact that the manifesto has been put to the background. It gives them a bit more flexibility in terms of how do we govern, how do we set up policy and a legislative agenda that represents the majority of people. So what you're seeing is a true coalition building, right? And that these guys have to come towards the center. You've got a kind of a fringe right-wing element in the opposition, but not really fringe, they're pretty large, right? They've got 5 million voters. But largely, you've got Barisan Nasional, you've got Pakatan Harapan, and their task now is to come to some kind of compromise which actually appeases both sets of supporters. And that's what I have for now. Thank
you, Shannon. Very insightful thoughts. I wanted to ask our panelists a couple of questions. I think one that was raised is, past success relative to the other parties and its past performance came as a surprise to many. Was it a surprise to you, and do you foresee it making greater inroads, especially in southern states like Johor? other question is what then is the future for BN, especially in these states? Is there a path for it to be revived, and what would that be?
Can I take the question first, Zakir?
Certainly, yep. Yeah, and then I invite Meredith as well. Yeah.
Thanks, my fellow panelists. The rise of PAS, it is not personally to me, because I've been following PAS very closely for the past 2 election cycles, and I personally don't find it surprising. Why? Because first, and I pointed it out many times, that the beneficiary of Undi 18, PAS, if you remember, when Syed Saddiq was a Minister of Youth and Sports, and he was championing the Undi 18 movement in Parliament, the first party to fully support it was PAS. Why? Because PAS has had kind of like a system where they've been targeting people, new PAS members from a young age. Officially, they say 15, 16, if I'm not mistaken. But there is a program that familiarizes these teen voters in a systematic way to PAS. And PAS, because of the way it functions, it indoctrinates its members. So they, when they break, not just that they were indoctrinated pretty effectively by PAS, but there is an ecosystem that supports it. So, and then you will bring your children, if you're a 20 plus 30 something male or female, you have young kids, you'll bring your young kids to PAS events and get them familiarized with PAS system. There's a PAS endorsed bakery, PAS endorsed kind of like kedai runcit, what do we call that, grocery stores. So you know the kind of like profiling of PAS voters. So it doesn't come as much of a surprise when they got a lot of the young voters. 1, 2 is the institutionalization of Islam in Malaysia in our mainstream education system over the past 3 decades. And one can argue it started with Prime Minister Anwar now, when he was Minister of Education in the late 80s, and later when he was Minister of Finance, so on and so forth. But that institutionalization of Islam, if one were to say, I was in a forum recently when someone pointed out, no, it could just be a swing, like 1999. It was a flash in a pan, PAS got most of the votes. That was the first part of that institutionalization. The institutionalization has matured. We are, it's 20 years from, almost 20 years, 20 plus years from 1999, right? So those who are kids who were in the education system in the 80s are now in the 40s, and they are kind of like, their kids are now solid product of this institutionalization of Islam. What I mean by institutionalization of Islam in the education system, the contact hours of Islamic teaching in Malaysian national schools have increased tremendously over that period of time. So I don't have the numbers with me, but anecdotal evidence, people pointing out, like, because it's not just Islamic education, it's Arabic, it's the Fardu Ain, some of the rituals. So to an extent, the Islamic teaching is almost like maths, in terms of contact hours, is equal to maths and science teaching in national education system. So institutionalization is a big issue. So whether or not the permanence of this teal wave, it's dependent on the impact of that institutionalization, and of course how well PAS does in the next, how it behaves itself in the opposition and in the state governments that they are currently on. But I have to say that they adapt digitally. So this is, many people have this misconception that PAS politicians are just religious leaders. No, there are professionals in PAS. There are lawyers, doctors, accountants in PAS, and they are very adept at social media as well. So they present a different face to PAS than the older, more traditional leaders like Haji Hadi Awang. And I would like to touch just a bit on the future for BN. The key for BN to revive itself is to learn the right lessons from this election and the past two cycles of elections. What is that lesson? One is that the main issue is that, and they've been brushing this off, is that values mean something to the Malays. Meredith has alluded to this. I'm sure, and Shannon too, we hear this a lot on the ground, like they are upset over corruption allegations. So values do mean something to the constituents. And if UMNO, which is the anchor party of BN, continues to ignore this, then the Malay electorates now have options. There are alternatives. It is not that they are in love with PAS, but we can argue that actually a sizable amount of that vote that went to PAS was a protest votes against UMNO, right? So this is something that if BN is really wants to revive itself, it needs to address. I remember another forum, someone asked me, so in that case, can Malaysia do away with BN totally, right? Like if it doesn't revive itself, but you can get rid of BN from the whole political equation. For the time being, you need BN to be the more moderate choice between these two extremes. But of course, things can change if PH with, say, just UMNO in a permanent alliance with UMNO, then probably we will have a bit more Malay anchor on the PH side. And for PN, if PN can be more Malaysian, more to the center, if it can include other non-Malay parties, then you may not then need to have that BN in the center. But then again, it's hypothetical, but those are just some of my thoughts.
Thanks. Meredith, Shannon, have you got any?
I'll say just a bit. I would agree with what Amir just said. I think part of it, what's helpful is to really contextualize the PN advance. So there are a number of things going on. So part of it is if you look at what they were actually campaigning on, a lot of it was anti-corruption, not being Zahid, not being UMNO. There was much less, I mean, to the extent that in meeting with different, candidates from PAS and Bersatu, we'd ask them, well, what about RU355? What about, there wasn't a very clear agenda attached to that. It was running in the same way that other parties were of, here's a broad profile. We are not UMNO in the sense that we do not have Zahid and we are more clean. Not what they are actually for. So that made it an easier choice as the other Malay party or coalition beyond BN. And that's part of why it's difficult to separate out what is PAS and what is a green wave and what is not. At the same time, all of what Amir said about the sort of rise of Islamism is definitely true. So in the last election where we could get a much better sense in GE14 of where PAS made gains because it was running essentially independently, there we saw that about a third of the Malay vote went to PAS. So that does suggest, and it trended young. So I do think that there is that an uptick in support for PAS, but not necessarily to the extent that we saw in this election where PAS was the best performing party. PAS on the ground had better machinery, and normally BN machinery trumps PAS machinery just because they're so good on the ground. BN had less resources. There was definitely not the coherence of support, including an MIC and MCA within BN or the other auxiliary parties that in the past have been part of BN. So I think, again, that makes it a little bit hard to judge. And then I had to wonder if some of the old saws in which PAS ran, in its PAS sense, so in Kelantan, for instance, listening to Taki Yudin go on about Anwar sodomy trials and the DAP is communist and so on, it may just be naive optimism, but I'd like to think that someday some of these old bogeys will fade from prominence, that they'll have to come up with a more proactive message to maintain that support. So that also tempers, again, how we should see this moving forward. And it's worth recognizing, this keeps falling from the discussion, DAP also performed really well. So they were the second highest performing party, and they did not decline substantially from last time. So despite the fact that attention goes to Keadilan and to Anwar, it's actually DAP that remains the crux of PH in a lot of ways. So I think that that's worth noting. These are the two most programmatic parties at this point, DAP, they were the clearest identity at least, DAP and PAS. And so they're both different polls to watch. In terms of the BN, I think so much just depends on the party election. So it's really hard to say what direction the party will go. If Zahid really does manage to pull another win next time, I thought after GE14, the party election then, that there would be a shift in UMNO, that they had dropped, that it would be, the renewal. And I was totally wrong. So I could be totally wrong again. I would think that there might be, just because of how aggressive some of the early statements, not just from the obvious people, were about the fact that Zahid did lose the election for BN and should step down. Yes, he's managed to pull out a win, but I do think that we'll have to see what happens to UMNO in particular. I think at this point, MIC and MCA are window dressing for the BN. They are not significant players. Sorry, MIC and MCA. But I do think that so much will depend on what happens then. If UMNO elects a more reformist slate, if new voices come through, or at least manages, if there's a sort of a push, at least to articulate a clearer agenda for UMNO as being centrist, for instance, as claiming that middle ground, rather than moving to the right as an ethno-nationalist party in order to counter PN and stake out its position vis-a-vis PH, I think that there might be more of a sense of where it might claim an agenda moving forward. But I think it's at this point too early to tell.
Thanks, Meredith. I'm mindful of the time, and I wanted to just add on another question before inviting Shannon to perhaps give us thoughts first. From Mano, Anwar's 75 now. Even if he stays on the reform course, he may not be around for long. Who is or who are the likely successors, and what are they thinking on major policies? But also, I think what needs to be done to put the country on a path of sustainable growth. Shannon, and then maybe you'll invite Meredith and Amir as well.
Wow, those questions. I just want to say I think what about past and stuff like that, the ground's been covered pretty well by the other two panelists. I do want to note that your logo is also teal. But on BN, I think one of the things that takeaways that I had from talking to some of the UMNO guys post-election was that UMNO hasn't changed, not just in this talk of whether it's going to be more reformist or it's going to get rid of corrupt leaders, so on and so forth. I mean, that's the front-facing stuff. But internally, it is still the same party. It is always still been focused. It's very inward-looking party, right? They think about internal intrigue even before things like electoral narrative or strategy. So when they went into this election, it was again about internal intrigue. And they might still have had the best comms people or the best people organizing drama, so on and so forth. But they still would have lost this election because none of those guys in the communications teams or the information teams knew what the message was. Could they, for instance, right, go out there and say, our Prime Minister is Ismail Sabri, he's great, don't worry about Zahid, and move forward on that? They couldn't, because they would be afraid of angering a huge segment of the party, and vice versa, right? If they went on this messaging that Zahid's actually a great guy, he was recently acquitted of 40 charges, all this is political persecution, then the comms team would be attacked by the Ismail Sabri guys, right? So the internal intrigue always takes precedence in UMNO, and it didn't matter before, right? All the way up to 2013, it never mattered before because they would win by default. And what matters more is, in fact, the UMNO party elections. And the same thing happened this time. And there's a sense here that a lot of people held back their resources because they were looking 5-6 months ahead. And it's going to be this thing that we'll be talking about, the party elections when the time comes. And that's going to have a huge impact, obviously, on national politics, on Anwar's government, and so forth. Moving on to the questions about Anwar's own longevity, his successors, policy thinking. I think on paper, people are looking at Rafizi as the direct heir, right? The problem being that Anwar and Rafizi aren't on the same page on a lot of things. They're probably not on the same page on succession plan either. So that it's deja vu, isn't it? I mean, this was the Anwar Azmin dynamic as well. The fact being that Anwar just couldn't let go. He did not want his number two to supplant him, and he felt that he still had legs. And well, eventually now he's been proven right that he still has legs. He still can become the Prime Minister. Question now is for how long should he become Prime Minister, and how long, not necessarily so much for his own ambition, but what would be good for Pakatan Harapan? How long should he stay, which would leave Pakatan Harapan in a good state? One would say that long enough that you allow a successor to come up from one of your parties that is going to be acceptable to not just all your coalition partners right now, but if you're going to move forward with this whole PHBN alliance thing, then it's got to be acceptable to UMNO as well. And that's, I don't think anyone's really thought about that question yet. And it's very early days. They've been in power for a month. Trying to get this conversation going on among the ruling parties about, so who's going to succeed Anwar seems a bit premature. But if you're looking at the Rafizis, the Nick Nazmis, and so on and so forth down the party line, when you think about what they think about major policies, it is pretty radical. I think if one of the things that Anwar did was not let Rafizi be MOF, right? I mean, we talk about the things that he's doing, but some of the things, he can be defined by the things that he did not do as well, which was not let Rafizi become MOF, because Rafizi's ideas are a bit radical with regards to how to run the country's economy. They're not necessarily wrong, right? But there is the sense that Anwar wants to keep a lot of things on status quo. He wants to avoid the kind of pitfalls that afflicted the Mahathir administration. Mahathir and his cabinet at that time, not just him alone, went in very hard, very fast, right? And they alienated a lot of support, not just in terms of voters, but within the civil service, within the entire institutional kind of machinery of government. That's what happened in that 22-month span. So it looks very much on paper that Anwar wants to avoid this. So on that next question about sustainable economic growth, so on and so forth, I mean, I'm not an economist myself, but it really does boil down to the question. When they want to balance out this whole question of not scaring off people by doing things too fast, too soon, right? Do they have the time? Is there enough time to tweak things and still be on what we call this sustainable economic growth path? You can sit down and have an entire 2-hour session about all the problems about Malaysia's economic structure, right? And how much of that can be changed in this coming 5-year term. So that's something where people who know more about the economy can answer, but in the political sense, right? That's the tug of war game, how much you can actually take out of the system while keeping things on an even keel.
Thanks, Shannon. Meredith, Amir, any other thoughts?
I'll add one thing, and then I'll leave Amir the last word on this. So I think I'll go in the reverse order of this question. So in terms of sustainable economic development, to some extent it would be great, but unlikely if there were more of a rethinking of some of the sort of building blocks like education. So there's a question in the chat also about that. But it's not just a question of, for instance, whether there's a push to make for a more secular education or not. But for instance, it was a little disappointing not to see those with a really strong background in whether primary, secondary, or higher education in those cabinet positions. Just because, the level of underemployment of public university graduates, for instance, is really egregious, and so ways to build a sustainable economic growth model include increasing productivity, increasing the sense of social mobility by making it possible for this is, part of Muda's appeal that, students may study something like engineering, but it's just the salaries aren't worth it, that they're not coming out with the skills that good employers need, all of those same issues that have been plaguing Malaysia for a long time. So I don't really see much drive to address those sorts of fundamentals. Rather, my sense is that there'll be more of the sort of satisficing of payouts to this and that group, trying to make it through the current or coming economic recession, keeping fuel prices manageable, subsidies where necessary, but that's not really a method to get out of the middle income trap. In terms of the succession to Anwar, one way of thinking about this is that Pakatan, and specifically Anwar, has followed the UMNO model rather than the DAP model. The DAP model, which looks a lot like the PAP model, is grooming successors. So you have Lim Kit Siang with his various aides who then move up in the party. Then you have that for Guanang and so forth. whatever you can say about Guaneng, I think he still followed at least his father's model. And so you always have the sense of a succession plan and of up and coming leaders. In UMNO, as in Keadilan, up and coming leaders are seen as threats to a much greater extent. And so you don't really have a culture within the party. And I'm exaggerating, of course, to some extent, because, why not? But you don't really have the sense of who should be the next one up, because that person, given Anwar's own history, dating back to the 1990s, and then Osman's history, and now the Rafizi, it's not the sense of, we want a party that has a bench, that has a number of people who could all step in when you have leaders in their 70s or 90s, as the case may be at some points, but rather that these people may usurp. And so some of not having term limits, for instance, makes that a chronic issue. So just passing a 2-term limit, for instance, could radically change the sense for the party, the imperative of bringing in new leadership. But until that happens, I don't think that that's really a thing. So yeah, Rafizi would be a natural potential successor. So might Saifuddin in some ways, but it's just that just as for UMNO, any of these leaders are hard pressed to really press to show their mettle and to gain that sort of executive experience because of the structure of the party.
Thanks, Meredith. Amir, last thoughts?
I just wanted to add on to what Meredith said about the PKR being more like UMNO in terms of succession planning. It was a party born out of UMNO. So obviously it will be similar model. But so far it's in PKR, one can look at Rafizi, and it's very interesting to note that the key economic ministries in Malaysia, the EPU is led by Rafizi, the MOF is by Anwar. So the PKR will have a big say on economic policies in going ahead, and what they choose to prioritize. I would want to think that given the DNA of the party, it would be a bit, so you see, PKR is a multiracial party, right? Therefore, the past 30 years of, how I look at my hypothesis and on why UMNO became more, they reached out for identity politics. They were goated, they were baited by PAS in the 90s. So they moved further to the right, and just because of inertia, UMNO, a bigger party of 3 million, was stuck in a corner when PAS flipped, because it was a more flexible party, to be with DAP in Pakatan Rakyat in 2008. So UMNO was stuck there, and to come back to the center is more difficult. All right, 1. 2, another thing that I'm also, and it ties in with the economy, is if you remember, PAS has always been going on about welfare state. And suddenly they've gone quiet on welfare state over the last election cycle. But what that I noticed when I did my engagements was that actually the idea of the welfare state is seeded in the whole idea of a compassionate government where you live on handouts, assistance from the government. So in a way, it's a pseudo welfare state that PAS has always wanted. So PAS has been able to bait all its opponents to going into their agenda, and this is how PAS seems to work, and it's been successful. So in looking for the future post Anwar, I started earlier with saying that now we have a closure, and that closure is very important because then it means that, okay, what's next? All right, and Rafizi is a clear one example in PKR. The generation that lost, the group that lost the elections and that lost their seats in this election, Khairi in UMNO, Nurul Izzah, these are household names, and they are young, so don't cast them aside just yet. But in UMNO, if UMNO wants to go back to being dominant, will it skip a generation? That is a question that I've always been thinking, in discussing in forums. Can it afford to skip a generation and give rise to younger leaders? But having said that, Anwar is 75. We have a track record of having a 90 plus as Prime Minister. So it's still young, and Anwar may outlast some people, but that is just some preliminary thoughts. But in terms of reforms, economic agenda, as I've said just now, because of that welfare state, people are dependent on government assistance, and it's very difficult to take it away. So how can the government move forward? One way that I see is taxing the rich more, widening that narrative of the rich versus the poor. So if identity politics, UMNO and PAS has give birth to like racial, identity politics via the racial lens, PKR would probably, they will move, because they're a multiracial party, they won't touch that line, but it could be intra-ethnic wealth class struggles that will be exploited, and in order to build this new economic model where it is fairer for everyone. And key to this, and I think Rafizi has been thinking a lot about it, is digitalization. He's done a lot of work on his own there. And I know the digital agenda is under the Economic Planning Unit. And therefore, it's very interesting to see how he uses digital solutions to solve this Malaysian problem where we have low wages. All right, so I'm interested to see this myself. And if you can solve it, Malaysians can have decent and growing wages, and that would be important for the political longevity and survival of Pakatan Harapan-led government.
Thanks so much, Amir, Meredith, Shannon, for your really quite thoughtful insights, and I think taking us not just into what happened at the elections, but also what could happen in the coming years. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next event. We can end the recording here, and thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks Amir, Meredith, Shannon.